The letter weighed heavily in Margaret Keating's trembling hands, the pages worn from countless readings during the long journey west. As the stagecoach rattled over the uneven terrain toward Deadwood, South Dakota, she wondered for the 100th time if she had made a terrible mistake in accepting the marriage proposal from a man she had never met. Spring of 1879 had arrived, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings, but Margaret felt only dread. After losing everything back east, her parents to influenza, her teaching position to budget cuts, and her modest inheritance to her father's creditors, becoming a mail-order bride had been her last resort. Now, barreling toward her future husband, a rancher named Mason Xander, who had advertised for a practical, hardy woman of good character, Margaret's courage was rapidly failing her. "First time to Deadwood, miss." The elderly woman seated across from Margaret offered a kind smile. Margaret nodded, smoothing her gray traveling dress, which had once been her Sunday best but now showed signs of wear after weeks on the road. "Yes, madam, I'm to be married." "Mail order." The woman's voice held no judgment, only curiosity. "Yes." Margaret's response was barely audible over the creaking of the coach. "I've never met him. Plenty of good men out here needing wives. Hard workers, most of them." The woman patted Margaret's knee. "My niece came out as a mail-order bride 5 years back. Has 3 little ones now and couldn't be happier." Margaret forced a polite smile but couldn't bring herself to believe such a fate awaited her. At 24, she had already resigned herself to a life without love. This arrangement was about survival, nothing more. The stagecoach lurched to a halt, and the driver called out, "Deadwood." End of the line. Heart pounding, Margaret gathered her single valise and stepped out onto the muddy Main Street. Deadwood was exactly as she had imagined, dusty, chaotic, and wild. Men in various states of inebriation staggered between saloons. Miners caked in dirt trudged wearily from a day's labor, and painted women called from balconies. The smell of horses, unwashed bodies, and whiskey permeated the air. Margaret stood frozen, clutching her valise to her chest as if it might shield her from this alien world. According to his letters, Mason Xander would be meeting her, recognizable by his black Stetson hat with a silver band. She scanned the crowd nervously, trying to ignore the stares her arrival had attracted. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough. A well-dressed Eastern woman was a curiosity. "You must be Miss Keating." The deep voice startled her. Margaret turned to face a tall man, his face partially shadowed by the wide brim of a black Stetson adorned with a tarnished silver band. He was not what she had expected. In her mind, she had pictured someone older, weathered and graying. This man couldn't be more than 30, with intense blue eyes that studied her with unsettling directness. "Mr. Xander?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. He nodded once, removing his hat in a gesture of politeness that seemed at odds with the roughness of his appearance. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable back east, and a scar ran along his jawline, but there was something undeniably handsome about his features. "Mason Xander, madam. Welcome to Deadwood." He made no move to take her hand or embrace her as a fiancé might. Instead, he reached for her valise. "Is this all you've brought?" "Yes." Margaret released the bag to him, aware of how little she possessed. "Everything else had to be sold to settle my father's debts." Something flickered across his face, pity perhaps, or disappointment, but it was gone before she could identify it. "My wagon's just over there. It's an hour's ride to my ranch." Margaret followed him silently, acutely aware of curious glances from passers-by. This was really happening. She was about to leave with a stranger who would become her husband. Panic rose in her throat. Mason helped her onto the wagon bench before securing her valise in the back. As he climbed up beside her, Margaret noticed the gun belted at his hip and the way his eyes continually scanned their surroundings. He was a man clearly accustomed to danger. They rode in uncomfortable silence for several minutes before Margaret found her voice. "Your letters didn't mention how large your ranch is, Mr. Xander. 500 acres, not the biggest spread, but it's mine free and clear." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Got 40 head of cattle, 8 horses, some chickens. The house is small but solid. Built it myself." Margaret nodded, struggling to find something else to say. "And you operate it alone? Got a hand who helps with the cattle? Miguel. Lives in the bunkhouse with his wife, Lucia. She helps with cooking when I need it." He glanced at her briefly. "But I've managed the household fine on my own." The implication was clear. He didn't need a wife for domestic purposes. Margaret wondered again why he had advertised for a bride. His next words answered her unspoken question. "A man needs heirs if he wants his land to mean something," he stated matter-of-factly. "And the territory's no place for a man to grow old alone." Margaret felt her cheeks burn. Of course, this was about children and convenience, not companionship or, heaven forbid, love. She should have known better than to harbor even the faintest hope for anything else. "I understand," she said quietly, staring down at her gloved hands. Mason cast her another sideways glance. "Your letters said you were a teacher." "Yes, for 5 years at a girls' academy in Boston. No schools in Deadwood need teachers." The question caught her off guard. I didn't inquire. I assumed as your wife I would be occupied with household duties." Mason nodded slowly. "Lucia can show you around the kitchen and such, but winter's long out here. If you want to teach, might be some families would pay for lessons." It was the first hint that she might have some freedom, some purpose beyond being a wife and mother. Margaret felt a tiny spark of something she hadn't felt in months possibility. "I would like that," she admitted. They fell silent again as the wagon climbed higher into the hills surrounding Deadwood. The landscape was breathtaking in its rugged beauty, so different from Boston's crowded streets and neat gardens. Despite her anxiety, Margaret found herself admiring the vast openness, the way the late afternoon sun gilded the tops of the pines. "There it is." Mason pointed to a clearing ahead where a small but well-built cabin stood, smoke curling from its chimney. A barn and corral sat to one side, and beyond them, rolling pastures stretched toward distant mountains. It was beautiful in a simple, honest way that touched something inside Margaret. But as the wagon rolled into the yard, her fears returned. Tonight she would be expected to share a home and eventually a bed with this stranger. Mason helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong but gentle at her waist. "You should know," he said abruptly. "There's no minister in Deadwood right now. Judge Williams can perform the ceremony, but he's away until next week." Relief washed over Margaret. A reprieve. "I see. You'll stay in the house. I'll take the barn until then." Margaret blinked in surprise. "That's not necessary, Mr. Xander. I wouldn't wish to displace you from your home." "It's proper," he said firmly. "You're not my wife yet." The unexpected display of honor surprised her. Perhaps there was more to Mason Xander than she had initially thought. He carried her valise to the door and pushed it open, gesturing for her to enter first. The cabin's interior was unexpectedly welcoming, clean and organized, with simple but solid furniture. A fire burned in the stone hearth, casting warm light across plank floors covered with hand-woven rugs. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with more volumes than she would have expected. "You read," she said, unable to hide her surprise. A hint of amusement crossed his features. "Did you think cowboys were illiterate, Miss Keating?" "No, she stopped, embarrassed by her assumption. "I apologize, I didn't mean to offend." "No offense taken." He set her valise down near a door that presumably led to the bedroom. My mother was educated, insisted I should be too. Margaret's eyes were drawn to a framed daguerreotype on the mantel, a handsome couple, the woman seated with gentle eyes, the man standing behind her with a serious expression. Your parents, Mason nodded, died in '73, cholera. I'm sorry. My parents passed last year, influenza. Their eyes met in a moment of shared understanding. They were both alone in the world. I'll show you where everything is, he said, breaking the moment. Then I need to see to the animals. The tour was brief, but thorough. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, the master where she would sleep, and a smaller one that Mason explained would be for the children when they come. There was a kitchen with a cast iron stove, a pantry well stocked with preserved foods, and a root cellar accessed by a trapdoor in the floor. Out back, a pump provided fresh water and a small garden plot waited for spring planting. It's lovely, Margaret said truthfully. The home spoke of care and attention to detail she hadn't expected. It's not much compared to what you're used to in Boston. Actually, my accommodations at the school were quite modest. She offered a small smile. And before that, my family's circumstances were comfortable but not luxurious. He studied her for a moment, as if reassessing his impression of her. Lucia left stew warming. I'll be back before dark. After he left, Margaret stood in the center of the main room, overwhelmed by the enormity of the change in her life. This would be her home now. This stranger would be her husband. And yet, as she explored the cabin more thoroughly, touching the spines of books, examining the neat stitching on the quilt in the bedroom, she began to feel that perhaps Mason Xander wasn't entirely the rough, unfeeling man she had feared. When he returned, they ate in awkward silence, broken only by Margaret's occasional questions about the ranch and Mason's terse replies. After dinner, he gathered a few items from the bedroom and prepared to leave for the barn. Mr. Xander, Margaret called as he reached for the door. May I ask you something? He turned, waiting. Your advertisement. You said you wanted a practical, hardy woman of good character. She hesitated. Do I meet your expectations? Mason regarded her steadily. You seem like a respectable woman, Miss Keating. Whether you're hardy enough for ranch life remains to be seen. The blunt assessment stung, but Margaret lifted her chin. I may not look it, Mr. Xander, but I'm stronger than I appear. Hope so, he said simply. Winters are harsh, work never ends, and Deadwood's still wild country. He paused, his expression softening slightly. But you made it here on your own. That says something. It wasn't much, but it was the closest thing to encouragement he had offered. As the door closed behind him, Margaret wondered if she could truly build a life here with this man. She didn't expect love, had given up hoping for it long ago, but perhaps they could forge a partnership based on mutual respect. That night, lying in Mason's bed surrounded by the unfamiliar scents of sage and pine, Margaret allowed herself to cry for the first time since leaving Boston. Not from despair, but from the overwhelming weight of uncertainty. When the tears finally stopped, she made herself a promise. She would not merely survive here, she would find a way to thrive. The next morning, Margaret rose early, determined to prove her usefulness. By the time Mason returned from his morning chores, she had breakfast-waiting biscuits that were slightly burned on the bottom but edible, and coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Mason raised an eyebrow at the biscuits but ate without complaint. You don't need to cook. Lucia will be by later. I want to learn, Margaret insisted. I can't depend on Lucia forever. He studied her with those intense blue eyes. Fair enough, but there's no rush. Take time to settle in. Their first week fell into an uneasy routine. Mason worked from dawn until dusk, returning only for meals. which improved gradually as Lucia patiently taught Margaret the basics of frontier cooking. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Mason cleaning his guns or mending tack while Margaret read or sewed. They rarely spoke beyond practical matters, two strangers sharing space but little else. On the seventh day, a Sunday, Mason surprised her by appearing at breakfast in clean clothes, his hair damp from washing. "Thought you might like to attend church services in town," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Meet some of the other women." Margaret was touched by the gesture. "I would like that very much, thank you." The small church at the edge of Deadwood was crowded with a mix of respectable families and reformed sinners seeking redemption. As they entered, curious gazes turned their way. Mason nodded stiffly to several men but made no move to introduce Margaret until a tall woman in a modest blue dress approached them after the service. "Mason Xander, don't tell me this is your bride-to-be." The woman's smile was warm as she extended her hand to Margaret. "I'm Sarah Miller. My husband Robert owns the general store. We've been waiting to meet you." "Margaret Keating," she replied, grateful for the friendly welcome. "A pleasure to meet you." "You must join us for Sunday dinner," Sarah insisted. "I won't take no for an answer. Robert's been pestering Mason to bring you by since he heard you'd arrived." Mason looked uncomfortable but nodded. "If Miss Keating would like to." "I would, thank you," Margaret said quickly. The Miller's home above their store was modest but comfortable. Over a meal of roast chicken and vegetables, Margaret learned that Sarah had also come west as a mail-order bride 10 years earlier. "Best decision I ever made," Sarah said, smiling at her husband. "Though I won't pretend it was easy at first." "Sarah cried every night for a month," Robert confessed with a good-natured chuckle. "Thought she'd made a terrible mistake marrying a shopkeeper in this wild town." "And now?" Margaret couldn't help asking. "Now I'd fight bears to stay," Sarah declared. "This is home." Throughout the meal, Margaret noticed how Mason relaxed in the Miller's company, even laughing at Robert's stories. It was the first time she'd seen him truly at ease, and the transformation was striking. His features softened, the hard line of his mouth yielding to occasional smiles that reached his eyes. On the ride back to the ranch, Margaret felt emboldened by the pleasant afternoon. "The Millers seem like wonderful people. Known Robert since '76 when I first came to Deadwood. Good man." Mason guided the horses with skilled hands. "Sarah's been a blessing to him. They seem very happy together." Mason glanced at her. "Not all marriages out here work out so well." The warning in his words was clear. Margaret sighed, looking out at the passing landscape. "Mr. Xander, may I speak plainly?" He nodded, his expression guarded. "I harbor no romantic illusions about our arrangement," she said carefully. "I know this is a practical matter for both of us. You need a wife and potential mother for your children. I need security and a home." She took a deep breath. "But I do hope we might at least become friends over time." Mason was silent for so long that Margaret feared she had overstepped. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I'm not good with words, Miss Keating, not good with feelings." He kept his eyes on the road. "But I respect you for making this journey, for taking a chance on an unknown future. That's courage. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. Thank you." "Judge Williams returns tomorrow," Mason added after another silence. "We can be married Tuesday if that suits you." Reality crashed back. In 2 days, she would become Mrs. Mason Xander. "Tuesday is fine," she managed to say. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret sat by the fire reading one of Mason's books, a collection of poetry by Whitman that surprised her with its worn pages and penciled annotations. The sound of the door opening startled her. Mason stood in the doorway, looking equally surprised to find her awake. "Forgot my ledger," he explained. "Need to review some figures before morning." "Of course." Margaret started to rise, but he gestured for her to remain seated. "Don't get up." "I'll just be a moment." He crossed to a desk in the corner and retrieved a leather-bound book. As he turned to leave, his eyes fell on the volume in her hands. "Whitman," he noted. "You enjoy poetry very much. I didn't expect." She hesitated, a cowboy to read Whitman. There was that hint of amusement again. "I'm learning not to make assumptions about you, Mr. Xander." Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a brief connection that made Margaret's heart beat a little faster. Mason broke the silence first. "It's late. You should rest." He hesitated at the door. "Good night, Miss Keating." "Good night, Mr. Xander." After he left, Margaret remained by the fire, the poetry book in her lap, pondering the complexity of the man she was about to marry. There was more depth to Mason Xander than she had initially believed, layers that perhaps few were allowed to see. Tuesday arrived with clear skies and a brisk spring wind. Margaret dressed in her best gown, a deep blue silk that had once belonged to her mother. It was slightly outdated in style, but the finest thing she owned. She pinned her dark hair up carefully and touched a tiny drop of precious rose water behind each ear. Mason appeared at the cabin door promptly at 10, dressed in a clean black suit that transformed his appearance. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he had shaved closely, revealing the strong line of his jaw. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, the compliment clearly uncomfortable on his tongue. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." They rode to Deadwood in silence, each lost in private thoughts. The justice of the peace was a portly, efficient man who performed the brief ceremony in his office with Robert and Sarah Miller as witnesses. Margaret repeated her vows in a steady voice, acutely aware of Mason's hand as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring. He had explained earlier. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Judge Williams declared. "You may kiss your bride." Margaret tensed, suddenly realizing this would be their first physical contact beyond the brief, impersonal touches when helping her into the wagon. Mason seemed equally uncertain as he stepped closer, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. His kiss was light, almost hesitant, but Margaret felt an unexpected warmth spread through her at the contact. They separated quickly, both slightly flushed. Sarah embraced Margaret warmly while Robert clapped Mason on the back. The Millers had arranged a small celebration at the hotel dining room, where several of Mason's acquaintances gathered to meet his new bride. Throughout the afternoon, Margaret observed her husband. The word still felt strange as he interacted with these people who clearly respected him. She learned that Mason had a reputation for fairness in business dealings and quiet generosity in times of need. More than once, someone mentioned how he had helped during the previous winter when supplies ran low, or how he had stood up to claim jumpers threatening a widow's property. By the time they departed for the ranch, their home now, Margaret felt a newfound respect for the man she had married. He might not be demonstrative or eloquent, but Mason Xander was, by all accounts, a good man. The ride back was silent, but less tense than before. As they approached the ranch, Margaret gathered her courage. "Mr. Xander Mason, I want you to know that I intend to be a good wife to you." He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Never doubted that. I may make mistakes as I learn, but we both will," he interrupted gently. "This is new territory for me too." The acknowledgement of his own uncertainty touched her. This strong, capable man was admitting vulnerability, however slight. At the ranch, Mason helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering briefly at her waist. "I need to see to the horses." Margaret nodded, understanding the routine but also recognizing his need for space. "I'll wait inside." She busied herself lighting lamps and building up the fire, trying not to think about what would happen when Mason returned. They were married now. Certain expectations existed. Her hands trembled slightly as she changed into her nightgown and robe, then sat by the fire to wait. When Mason finally entered, he had changed into clean clothes but still smelled of horses and the outdoors. He stood awkwardly just inside the door, as if unsure of his place in his own home. "Would you like some tea?" Margaret offered. "No, thank you." He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Xander, I want you to know that I don't expect." Margaret's heart pounded as she waited for him to continue. "A marriage should be based on mutual respect," he said finally. "I won't press you for wifely duties until you're ready." The relief that flooded her was so intense that tears sprang to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Mason nodded once, his expression softening. "The bedroom is yours. I'll take the small room for now." "But it's decided," he said firmly. "Good night, Mrs. Xander." After he left, Margaret sat by the dying fire, thinking about the man she had married. Mason Xander was nothing like she had imagined, neither the romantic hero of her girlhood dreams nor the rough, demanding frontier husband she had feared. He was something far more complex and perhaps far more worthy of respect. In the weeks that followed, Margaret and Mason settled into a companionable routine. During the days, she learned the rhythm of ranch life: cooking, cleaning, gardening, and even helping with some of the lighter outdoor work. Lucia proved an invaluable teacher, showing her how to preserve foods, make soap, and manage the countless tasks required to keep a frontier household functioning. In the evenings, the new couple would share quiet meals, gradually becoming more comfortable in conversation. Mason proved to be surprisingly well-read, and they often discussed books or current events reported in the newspapers that arrived sporadically from back east. He never mentioned their sleeping arrangements, continuing to use the small bedroom even as Margaret secretly wondered when that might change. One evening in late May, as Margaret was preparing supper, Mason arrived at the cabin with a stranger, a lean, weathered man with kind eyes. "Mrs. Xander, this is Doc Pearson," Mason introduced. "He's passing through on his way to Rapid City." "Madam," the doctor tipped his hat, "your husband insisted I stop for a proper meal before continuing my journey." "You're most welcome," Margaret said warmly. "Please sit down. Supper is nearly ready." Over the meal, Doc Pearson regaled them with stories from his travels across the territory. He had been a surgeon during the war before heading west to escape painful memories. Now he traveled between settlements, providing medical care where it was needed most. "The territory desperately needs educated people," he remarked to Margaret. "Especially teachers. Children out here grow up hard and fast, with little opportunity for learning." "My wife was a teacher in Boston," Mason said, surprising Margaret with the note of pride in his voice. "Is that so?" The doctor looked at her with renewed interest. "Have you considered teaching here?" "I've thought about it," Margaret admitted, "but I'm not sure where to begin." "Start small," Doc Pearson advised. "Offer lessons in your home to neighboring children. Word will spread." Later, after the doctor had departed with a packet of food for his journey, Margaret found herself considering his suggestion. "Do you think anyone would bring their children here for lessons?" she asked Mason as they washed dishes together. "Simmons has 4 children, none getting proper schooling. Hoyts have 3. Mason handed her a plate to dry. "Both families within riding distance." Margaret felt a flutter of excitement. "Would you mind if I taught here at the ranch?" Mason studied her for a moment. "This is your home too, Margaret. If teaching would make you happy, then you should teach." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it on his lips made her heart skip. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, his eyes holding hers a moment longer than necessary before he turned away. Need to check the north pasture fence tomorrow. Might be late for supper. Margaret recognized this for what it was, a return to safe, practical matters, but she had glimpsed something in his gaze that gave her hope. Not hope for love, perhaps, but for genuine friendship at least. The next day, Margaret rode with Mason to the Simmons ranch to propose her teaching idea. Rachel Simmons, a tired-looking woman with 4 energetic children, nearly wept with gratitude. "My oldest, Thomas, can barely write his name," she confessed. "John and I want better for them, but there's no time with all the ranch work." By the end of the week, Margaret had arrangements to teach 8 children from 3 families, 3 days a week. Mason cleared out a corner of the barn, installing a blackboard and crude desks he built himself. The gesture touched Margaret deeply. "This must have taken hours," she said, running her hand over the smooth wood of a desk. Mason shrugged. "Had the lumber. Wasn't difficult." But Margaret knew better. He had spent several evenings working on the furniture after long days of ranch work, his hands blistered from the effort. It was a gift, unspoken but meaningful. As May turned to June, Margaret's small school flourished. The children were eager to learn, soaking up knowledge like the dry Dakota soil absorbed rare rainfall. Teaching again brought her a sense of purpose and joy she had feared lost forever. Even Mason showed interest, occasionally stopping by during lessons to listen from the doorway, a small smile playing at his lips as he watched her in her element. One evening after the children had gone, Margaret found Mason repairing one of the desks that had wobbled during the day's lessons. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I could have managed." "I know." He continued working, his large hands surprisingly deft with the small nails. "Wanted to." Margaret sat beside him, watching him work. "The children adore you, you know, especially little Anna Hoyt. She talks about Mr. Mason constantly." A hint of color touched his tanned cheeks. "Just gave her a ride on my horse." It meant the world to her. Margaret hesitated, then added softly, "You're good with children. You'll make a wonderful father someday." Mason's hands stilled. The subject of children, of what would be required to have them, had remained unspoken between them. "Been thinking about that," he said finally, his voice low. "About us?" Margaret's heart quickened. "Oh, we've been married nearly 2 months." He set down his tools and turned to face her fully. "I meant what I said about waiting until you were ready. But I need to know if you'll ever be ready for a real marriage." The directness of the question caught her off guard, but Margaret appreciated his honesty. "I've been thinking about it too," she admitted. And Margaret took a deep breath. "When I came here, I was afraid. Not just of you, but of everything, this new life, the wilderness, the responsibilities of being a wife." She met his gaze steadily. "But you've been patient and kind. You've given me time to find my footing, to create a place for myself here, and I've come to care for you, Mason." His eyes darkened at her words. "Is that enough?" "I think it could be," she whispered. "With time." Mason nodded slowly. "I'm not asking for love, Margaret, never expected that. But I do want a true marriage." "As do I," she said, surprising herself with the realization that it was true. Somewhere along the way, her feelings for this quiet, honorable man had deepened into something more than mere respect. That night, when Mason followed her to the master bedroom instead of turning toward the small room, Margaret felt nervous but not afraid. His touch was gentle, his consideration for her comfort evident in every move. And when they finally came together as husband and wife, Margaret discovered that physical intimacy could be a bridge to emotional closeness she hadn't dared to hope for. As summer progressed, so did their relationship. Margaret found herself watching for Mason's return each evening, her heart lifting at the sight of him riding toward the cabin. For his part, Mason began to share more of himself, stories of his childhood in Missouri, his journey west after the war, his dreams for the ranch. Small touches became common between them, his hand at the small of her back, her fingers brushing his when passing a cup of coffee, casual intimacies that spoke of growing comfort. In late July, a violent thunderstorm swept through the area. Margaret was alone in the cabin, Mason having ridden out at dawn to check on cattle in the high pastures. As lightning split the sky and thunder shook the walls, she worried about his safety in the open country. By afternoon, the storm had intensified to frightening proportions. Rain lashed against the windows, and wind howled through the trees. When a particularly violent gust tore a branch from the old oak near the house, shattering one of the kitchen windows, Margaret's concern turned to genuine fear. She was struggling to board up the broken window when the door burst open and Mason staggered in, drenched and exhausted. "Mason," she rushed to him, helping him remove his sodden coat. "I was so worried. Storm caught me by surprise," he said, teeth chattering from cold. "Had to secure the cattle before heading back." Margaret quickly built up the fire and prepared hot coffee while Mason changed into dry clothes. When he returned to the main room, she wrapped a quilt around his shoulders and pressed the steaming mug into his hands. "You're fussing," he observed, but there was warmth in his voice. "You could have caught your death out there," she scolded gently. "What would I have done then?" The question hung between them, loaded with more meaning than she had intended. Mason's eyes met hers over the rim of his cup. "Would you have mourned me, Margaret?" he asked quietly. "Of course I would," she replied, suddenly unable to look away from his intense gaze. "You're my husband." "Is that the only reason?" Margaret's heart pounded as she recognized the vulnerability in his question. "No," she whispered. "That's not the only reason." Something changed between them in that moment. As the storm raged outside, they found themselves speaking of things they had kept hidden: hopes, fears, regrets. Mason confessed his loneliness before her arrival, how the empty cabin had echoed with silence each night. Margaret admitted her terror at coming west, her desperation after her parents' deaths, and her initial certainty that she would never find happiness again. "I was wrong," she said softly, seated beside him on the small sofa, their shoulders touching. "I've found purpose here, contentment." "Just contentment?" Mason asked, his voice rough with emotion. Margaret turned to face him, gathering her courage. "No," she said. "More than that, I've found feelings I didn't expect." She took a deep breath. "I think I might be falling in love with you, Mason Xander." The confession hung in the air between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Mason's expression was unreadable for a long moment, and Margaret feared she had spoken too soon, revealed too much. Then his hand came up to cup her cheek, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "I never thought to hear those words," he said hoarsely. "Never thought I'd find a woman who could love me." "Why not?" she asked, leaning into his touch. "I'm not an easy man, Margaret, set in my ways, better with animals than people." His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "But from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach, something in me knew you were meant to be here." "I was so afraid," she confessed, "so uncertain. I saw it in your eyes." His lips curved in a slight smile. "That first day, when you looked at me like I might bite, I wondered what I'd gotten myself into, bringing an educated Eastern woman to this wild place. And now I thank God every day for whatever desperation brought you to answer my advertisement." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Because I love you, Margaret. Have for weeks now. Just didn't know how to say it." The words broke something open inside her, a dam of emotion she had held in check for too long. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she leaned forward to press her lips to his. This kiss was different from all that had come before, not hesitant or dutiful, but passionate and true. Later that night, as they lay tangled together in the bed they now truly shared, the storm outside finally beginning to abate, Margaret marveled at the journey that had brought her to this place, this man, this unexpected happiness. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "I'm thinking about hope," she said. "When I came here, I didn't know how to hope anymore. I'd lost faith that anything good could happen to me. And now—" His arms tightened around her. Margaret smiled in the darkness. "Now I have more hope than I know what to do with." As summer faded into autumn, the ranch flourished under their combined efforts. Margaret's school grew to 12 students, meeting now in a proper schoolhouse Mason had built with help from neighboring ranchers. Her garden produced abundantly, filling their root cellar with vegetables for the coming winter. And their marriage deepened into a partnership neither had dared to imagine when they first met. One crisp October evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant hills in gold and crimson, Margaret turned to her husband with news she had been keeping for 2 weeks, wanting to be certain before sharing it. "Mason," she said, taking his hand in hers. "I have something to tell you." He looked at her, those blue eyes that had once seemed so forbidding now filled with love. "What is it? In the spring, our family will grow by one." She placed their joined hands over her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." The joy that transformed his face was something Margaret would remember all her days, the way his eyes widened, then filled with tears he didn't try to hide, the trembling of his strong hands as they cradled her face, the reverence in his kiss. "A baby," he whispered against her lips. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, though his reaction had already answered her question. "More than I ever thought possible." He drew back to look into her eyes. "When I wrote that advertisement, I was looking for a practical arrangement, someone to share my name, bear my children, keep my house." His voice thickened with emotion. "Instead, I found the other half of my soul." Margaret leaned into his embrace, savoring the security of his arms around her. "And I found home," she whispered, "in the last place I expected." The Dakota winter came early that year, harsh and unforgiving as was its nature. But inside the solid cabin Mason had built with his own hands, warmth and love flourished. As snow piled against the windows and wind howled across the plains, Margaret and Mason Xander sat by the fire, reading together from a volume of Whitman, his hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her growing child. Margaret often thought back to their first meeting, her fear, his stoicism, the unbridgeable gap that had seemed to separate them. She remembered his words on that fateful day when hope had seemed an impossible luxury. "Try me." 2 simple words that had changed everything. In the spring of 1880, as the land awakened from winter's grip, their son was born, Matthew Robert Xander, named for both his grandfathers. As Margaret watched Mason hold their child for the first time, tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered cheeks, she knew that some journeys, however frightening at the outset, led exactly where one was meant to go. Over the years, the Xander family grew. Matthew was joined by a sister, Marie, 2 years later, and finally by twins Joseph and James in 1885. The ranch prospered, eventually expanding to 1,500 acres. Margaret's small school evolved into Deadwood's first official academy, where she served as headmistress until passing the role to a former student in 1900. Through it all, the droughts and blizzards, the boom and bust cycles of the mining town, the gradual taming of the territory as South Dakota achieved statehood, Mason and Margaret's love remained the bedrock upon which they built their lives. What had begun as a practical arrangement between strangers had blossomed into a love story that became legend in the hills around Deadwood. On their 25th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, Mason presented Margaret with a gift, a locket containing miniature portraits of them both, engraved with two simple words that had started their journey. "Try me. Did you know, even then?" Margaret asked that night as they sat alone on the porch of the home they had built together, now expanded and improved but still the same solid shelter against the wilderness. "Did you have any idea what we would become to each other?" Mason took her hand, his touch as familiar and necessary to her as breath itself. "I knew you were afraid," he said, "saw it in your eyes, but I also saw courage there, determination." His voice softened with memory. "Thought to myself, this woman might break, but she won't bend." Knew right then I'd found someone special. Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the stars emerge above the land they both loved. "I'm glad I was brave enough to try." Mason pressed a kiss to her silver-streaked hair. "So am I, my love, so am I." As the century turned and the frontier gradually disappeared into history, the story of the mail-order bride who arrived without hope and the taciturn cowboy who taught her to believe again was passed down through generations of Xanders. Their legacy lived on not just in the prosperous ranch that bore their name or the school Margaret had founded, but in the example they set that love could grow in the most unexpected places, that courage was often rewarded in ways one could never anticipate, and that sometimes the greatest journeys began with the smallest steps of faith. In the family Bible, carefully preserved through the decades, a faded newspaper clipping remained pressed between the pages, a simple advertisement seeking a practical, hardy woman of good character to marry a Dakota rancher. Beside it, in Margaret's elegant hand, were written the words that had become the family motto: "Hope finds a way," and so it had.